Have you ever noticed how in 5th edition almost every martial ends up using the same few weapons? To take a brief look at the weapons table, there's 37 different base weapons, and only 9 that I can see that are regularly used as a main weapon. Even when you take out the simple versus martial weapon divide, there's still weapons that are left entirely by the wayside simply because of how the mechanics of the game are set up. And I think reducing the choice for players in this mechanical way is a travesty. I also think it's not really the weapons' fault. It's mostly the monsters, and also a little bit how classes are set up, but we'll get to that later. Look at this image and you see everything you need to know about your base D&D weapons. Their name, their cost, the amount of damage they deal, their weight, and any properties that are applicable to them. Everything you could possibly need, and one thing that really doesn't matter at all. I'm referring, of course, to the type of damage that the weapon deals. These weapons all deal bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, or not and, never and, it's only or. They deal one of 3 types of damage, and this is where our problem lies. Damage types need to be distinguished. This makes sense, especially when there's magic damages involved. Fire elementals are made of fire. They should be immune to fire damage. That's all good, we're all good. This makes sense so far. But you have weapons that are distinguished by damage type, which again is good so far. However, in the entire base 5e monster manual, there are only 3 monsters that are immune or resistant to one of those 3 damages, and not all of those 3 damages. Skeletons are vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, and 2 different oozes are immune to slashing damage, and every other monster doesn't care whether you're dealing bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing. That means when you choose your weapon, all that matters to you is the amount of damage that deals. There's really no other reason to consider the type of damage it does. It also eliminates the fun need to carry a bunch of different weapons. If you're a fighter, it's fun to carry a few different swords, a spear, a bow, and something that deals bludgeoning damage, because hey, you might have the tools that are right for the specific scenario we're in. But instead, they're just all lumped together. It removes choice. It also gives all the ability to bypass resistances and immunities to casters, which worsens the martial caster divide that everyone's always whining about. It's also frustrating because it's an easy fix. All you have to do is use the mechanics as they're currently designed to be used, and used in 3 very specific scenarios. But it just isn't. It's frustrating because by not incorporating this rule more heavily, it eliminates a path of character creation, a path of play, where you can choose to carry a bunch of weapons and sacrifice other adventuring gear, where you can choose to get really good with weapons that only deal one type of damage because you know you're going to run into something that is vulnerable to just that one type and therefore be an absolute weapon against it. That's a very real possibility under these raw rules that has just been eliminated because of the way the monsters are designed. Again, all you would need to do to fix this is give monsters resistances or immunities or vulnerabilities to one of the 3 base types of damage instead of all 3 at the same time. Even 2, just leave one that is still applicable against the enemy. Make them resistant or immune to 2, but instead, it's always 3, except for 3 cases, or none. It also has the potential to make weapon selection way more interesting. Take swords, for example. Swords should be more versatile in the amount of damage they deal, or rather the type of damage they deal. They generally have points and generally have a cutting edge, which means they should be able to do slashing and piercing damage. That makes sense. That works. But instead, it's one or the other, and therefore it makes swords in general a less versatile weapon than it actually is. And then if you were to make swords that little bit more versatile, it could be reflected in damage. You deal 2 different types of damage, and therefore maybe you don't deal as much damage. So when you're choosing a weapon, you get to consider whether you're dealing the right type of damage or more damage. It also makes physical sense. Someone putting their whole body weight behind a spear should deal more piercing damage than someone thrusting a broadsword. And also there's a whole part of the game that is kind of useless. It's the ranger. And in all seriousness, this is kind of true. A lot of what the ranger is understanding their environment and understanding the enemies that you're up against. But because that actually doesn't really matter, the ranger feels underpowered and has for a long time, and this whole type of damage selection and the way that you go about fighting a monster feels like you don't really need to. You don't need to do any of that. Scouting doesn't matter. You just need to rush into combat and deal the most damage. But by prioritizing information and knowing that there's different types of damage that matter a whole lot, well then it makes weapon selection more interesting, and it makes the pre-combat stage of D&D more interesting, and it offers more choice. It offers more paths of play, which I am in favor of. I think that's where the basis of weapons in D&D and the reasons that you're stuck with fewer choices than it feels like you should have. I think that is most of it. I think that's a large part of it. But there's also some more minor points that are pretty specific and pretty important to why weapons feel kind of not that fun, and I'm gonna go over them really quickly. Basically, the way that classes are set up, you're always left with very few optimal choices. If you're a rogue or a ranger, you're looking for dexterity weapons, which means you're either gonna use a rapier, a scimitar, or a short sword if you're up close. Rangers really have no reason not to fight with 2 short swords if they're fighting melee, because they can deal the most damage. So there's no reason to use anything but 2 short swords. It's the most damage for the least cost. It's the same for the rogues until they get a cunning action, and then if they want to use their bonus action to disengage instead of make an offhand attack, well then they're going to probably switch to a rapier because you deal 1d8 instead of 1d6. And again, there's not really any reason not to do that. At 5th level, rangers get a second attack. If they're fighting at range, that means they're going to want to stick with a longbow. Otherwise, there's no reason not to use 2 hand crossbows, and the same goes for rogue. There's no reason not to use 2 hand crossbows. So all of a sudden, all of these options, these 37 options, if you're a rogue or a ranger, you know you're actually picking from 5. If you're a strength-based fighter, you're either fighting with a shield or with a 2-handed weapon. If you fight with a shield, you're going to use a battle axe, a longsword, or a warhammer, because they deal the most damage when wielding with one hand compared to any other one-handed weapon. If you fight with a 2-handed weapon, you're going to use a greatsword, a great axe, or a maul. Again, they just deal the most damage. Just like that, we're down to 3 or 4 options, with the outlier, of course, being fighters, because as a fighter, you can choose to be a dexterity or strength-based fighter. But on the whole, every martial class ends up being channeled towards just one of a few options. Now, I don't think this is as big of a deal for the simple reason that you have to make a bunch of choices before you arrive at these few optimal options. And that's okay, right? You have to make choices and then you can pick from a few options that are optimal for those choices. I just think it's not as fun as it could be. I think part of the fault of this is because things like reach and special properties end up almost entirely eliminating the options. Like a lance is bad because you're often going to get an enemy up in your face. The vast majority of the time, when you're dealing melee damage, your enemy is going to get right up to within 5 feet of you, and that means you have to be mounted all of a sudden, and then that's a pain. So why would you use a lance when there's an easier option that you don't have to worry about that? And reach should be really cool, but it's just kind of not, because again, it's so easy to close on people that having a reach weapon is not worth sacrificing the damage. It's just sort of an oversight of the mechanics. And it's another thing that could be kind of at least partially fixed by having this whole resistance and immunity thing changed. Because if you're using a weapon that's maybe not quite as optimal in damage, but it deals a type of damage that is more optimal, then suddenly that weapon becomes a real choice instead of a not so real choice. And I do want to very briefly say, don't tell me to go play Pathfinder. Okay, I have played Pathfinder. Its resistance rules are good, but they're also different. You have a value attached to your resistance, which is not how D&D works. And also, I think it's okay to want to improve D&D instead of just immediately hopping systems, okay? So I love Pathfinder. I'm not talking about Pathfinder. Telling me to go play Pathfinder is actually not constructive in this case. But if you do have some constructive thoughts, other ways that you think weapons could be fixed, you know, some cool new skins for weapons, just a wider variety of weapons. The way the weapons are in D&D right now is not as good as I think it could be. So if you have suggestions for how to fix that, I would love to hear them. Either way, thanks for watching, and remember, the important thing is to keep on rolling.